Greetings, folks, and welcome back to another episode of History Up Close. My name is Sterling Gillum, and I'm honored to be the director of your National Naval Aviation Museum, and we're thrilled to put on these Facebook Live events sponsored by the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. To date, we've been focused on what we would call macro artifacts. Airplanes, big airplanes like our NC-4 flying boat, the venerable EA-6B Prowler, the Aviate Harrier, and other aircraft. Today, we'd like to mix things up a little bit and show you some of our micro artifacts, some of the smaller things that represent the over 35,000 items we have in our collection here in Pensacola. And we're very fortunate to have with us today our curator, Ms. Dina Linn, and our archivist, Marc Levitt. These phenomenal museum professionals work each and every day to make your National Naval Aviation Museum the absolute best aviation museum in the world, and we're thrilled to have them here today. Marc, Dina, take it away.
Thank you, Captain. As he said, my name is Marc Levitt, and I'm the archivist here at the museum. And I see our first question is, what is an archivist? And that's an excellent question. So what we deal with is sort of like a library, except that a lot of our materials are actually one-of-a-kind manuscripts. So they'd be things like letters written home, or orders, or a collection of photographs that maybe nobody else has seen. Another way of looking at archives is we collect a subject matter and put it all together. So naval aviation, that's what we have here. Now we have about 3,000 linear feet here in the collection. That equates to about 2 million individual pages. As I said, that's letters, photographs, but it also includes born digital material. So that's things we may have digitized for preservation, or things that come to us born digitally. Somebody who took a digital photograph, or tweets, emails, things like that. And so me, alongside with some of our volunteers, we manage the archival component, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. I'm going to hand it over to our curator, Dina Linn.
Well, welcome everyone. As Captain Gillum said, we have over 35,000 individual objects here at our museum, not counting the archival collection that Marc just spoke of. And we have these objects here for a reason. Each one tells a story, a personal, a human story that we can share with the public. And today we're going to be sharing a few of those with you, in particular some artifacts that are my favorites. So if Donald could just pan around to take a look at our beautiful wood case here. This came to us from the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History many years ago. It is over 100 years old. It used to hold their butterfly collection, and now it holds our treasures here at the museum. So we're going to do something that we never do when visitors come in person. We are going to open up this case, especially for you viewers at home, and Marc has the key there. We're going to open this up. Okay. Each take a side. There we go. So one of my favorite stories here at the museum has to do with one of our very early space astronauts, or a monkey knot, if you will, that lived right here on board Naval Air Station Pensacola. Miss Baker is the smaller of the two monkeys that you see there. She is the squirrel monkey, and her co-pilot, if you will, was a rhesus monkey named Miss Abel. Abel was the Army's candidate, and Miss Baker belonged to the Navy. And she was selected from one of 25 squirrel monkeys for her calm demeanor to be sent into outer space as part of an experiment. Up until that point, this is 1959, no life forms had been successfully launched into outer space from the United States. And so this was really a big deal that these two monkeys were launched into outer space. They flew for 16 minutes, and they came back safely and were celebrities upon their return. They actually went to the White House. They went to a press briefing with the president. 4 days after their return, the rhesus monkey unfortunately died, but Miss Baker went on to live, and she became a celebrity here in Pensacola. She was married 2 times. Her first husband, Gordon, and she lived here for about 11 years. Then they were transferred to the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where they lived for many more years. Her first husband died. She was married a second time, and she is buried out there in Huntsville. And we have a few of her artifacts here in our collection. We have the rubber mold that was used to conform to her body so that she could be safely launched in the capsule that you see. We have her little rubber helmet, which is very delicate, that was also custom fit to her head. We have a leather one in the collection as well. And then we have her little fireproof vest that was hand cut and sewed by machine, custom fit to her as well. Donald, if you follow me over here, we also have the actual capsule, the piece that was in the nose cone of the rocket here, and you can see how the capsule would have fit snugly through that hole with the cover here and another of her molds. So the wonderful thing about the Miss Baker story is that she paved the way for other naval aviators who became astronauts to successfully launch into outer space. As you know, the first man to walk on the moon, Neil Armstrong, was a naval aviator, and the last man to walk on the moon, Gene Cernan, was also a naval aviator. So we're very proud of that legacy that they share with us today. And now Mark will talk to you about the people that were instrumental in the Baker mission.
Hey again, so no doubt about it, Miss Baker's the star of the show, but she could not have got there without her supporting cast. And one of the great things about an archive isn't just a single event from one collection. What we try to do is tell that story from a variety of collections and donations that we've received. And so here I've assembled some of the collections that are going to do just that. And we're going to meet a few people today. We're going to meet W. Carroll Hickson, who's the lead engineer of the project. We're going to meet Dr. Donald Stulkin, who is an aviation physiologist charged with monitoring Miss Baker and Miss Abel, their vitals. And then we're going to meet briefly Dr. Dietrich Beischer and Dr. Jay Niven, who was the assistant in charge of research. So we're going to start with Carroll Hickson, which we see a couple of photographs from this collection. It's a small collection, so only about half a box, but it's really rich in its photographs. And what you see here is during the testing as an engineer, you'll see actually Hickson here in the F4 Phantom. I'm sure a lot of you were wondering what that photo was for our promotion. He's actually inserting the capsule for a test run. So a lot of tests and R&D, of course, went into this to make sure that the monkeys would be safe. And as Dina said, paving the way later for manned spaceflight. And then we can see some of the material here as well, including the capsule Dina just showed you, hooked up to the various electronics and measuring devices to make sure that the monkeys were safe on their ride to and back to space. And then we have this notebook here. This scrapbook was actually donated by the Niven family, who was the assistant director of research. So here you see a publicity shot of Miss Baker posing with a miniature Jupiter rocket that she rode up on. And we also have up top here, Donald, what we have are Dr. Beischer, who was in charge of the biochemistry department, alongside Dr. Donald Stulkin. And Dr. Stulkin was very influential in making sure that she came back okay, and we're actually going to get to him in a minute. But what is great about these artifacts, as I said, is that they come to us throughout the years. And you can see just above it, we actually have a photograph from our institutional archive. And there you see both Stulkin and Beischer again when they donated the artifacts that you just had a chance to see. And you can tell they've recreated the photo that was taken that many years ago, about 40 years ago to that day. So that was a great donation that we received at the museum, and it just shows the story continues to go on and live. Now, one of the other interesting parts of the story, as I mentioned, was Dr. Donald Stulkin, and he donated his papers about in 2007, and we have a variety of things here. Now, Dr. Donald Stulkin went on to become the head of the recovery branch for NASA. So it was manned space flight, and he actually developed the Stulkin collar, and you can see a copy of the blueprint right there. And that became important because he was the director of recovery for not just Mercury, but Gemini and Apollo missions. So he went on to play a very important role in manned spaceflight, as from Miss Baker and the tests and things like that, all the way up through the actual successful landing of the moon. Now, he was aboard the Hornet, which is the lead recovery ship, right next to that photograph. And because he had not been on a naval ship before across the equator, he actually went through the shellback ceremony. So on their way to the recovery area on the Hornet, you can see here him going through, that's him there on his knees, him going through all the rituals and everything that a typical Navy person crossing the equator would go through. And there you'll see that he did indeed earn his shellback card. And so he was a good sport, but he became an important part of the crew. He did not see the landing on the moon because his main focus was the successful recovery and safe recovery of the astronauts that came down. And then finally, when we're talking about recovery, there was a task group that went out, of course, to recover Miss Baker and Miss Abel as well. And what was interesting about that is the person who led it was Rear Admiral Dan Gallery Jr. Now, he had some experience recovering things and looking for things in the water, because in World War II, he was actually tasked with leading a hunter-killer task force, 22.3, to look for German U-boats that were harrying transports and supply ships in the Atlantic. And he actually captured one, U-boat 505. It's famously in the Chicago Museum right now. But what we have here, what we found, was a photographer mate's collection from the USS Guadalcanal, which was the escort carrier that helped capture the U-boat 505. And here at the top, you can see that is then Captain Dan Gallery Jr. in charge of that particular operation. And then, as I said, he went on later to become the head of recovery for Miss Baker and Miss Abel. Now, what's interesting about that as well is that it wasn't without its perils. So when they did some test recoveries before, the area, when the cone splashed down into the water and the searchlights at night were sort of looking for this cone, the area actually was swarming with sharks. The earlier tests, there were so many sharks they couldn't even count them. Luckily, when Miss Baker and Miss Abel went in, there was only 1 to 3 sharks, so they weren't really in danger as they were at that time. They had some problems with the logistically getting on board, but of course, in the end, all went well, and it was Dr. Stulkin who immediately went to retrieve Miss Baker, check her vitals, and retrieve her safely from the capsule. And so you can see this is the strength, as I was saying, of an archive, is not just one person's collections or one institution's collections, but all these things go together to really tell a rich, full story that isn't just about an event, but it's about what came up to that event, in this case, the Miss Baker story, but also what happened after with Dr. Stulkin paving the way for the Apollo mission, which incidentally we are here in the museum's library, which is a rotating exhibit, and that's what we're celebrating here. So when you get a chance, when we're back open, I'd love to have you come check it out. Now we're going to take 2 more artifacts and archival pieces right over in the reading room, and we're going to learn all about 2 of our favorites. So come on this way. Dina's going to start with one of her favorite stories.
Welcome back. We are in the reading room. If you are a visitor of our museum, you will probably recognize this space. We answer research requests here. It's sort of the first line of defense for our research department. We also accept donations here. This is our formal space for meeting donors and asking them questions and making that personal connection. This collection is one of my favorites. It is the George Medal of Marine Corps History. I used to work at the Marine Corps Museum up in Quantico, Virginia, 6 years ago before arriving here. And what I love about the Naval Aviation Museum is that we marry Navy and Marine Corps history together. So I'm honored to still preserve the history of the U.S. Marine Corps, and this is one of our most special artifacts. The George Medal was something that the Marines came up with themselves to commemorate their actions on Guadalcanal. And it's named the George Medal because the saying, "Let George do it," was a favorite mantra of theirs, in saying that the Navy had sort of, in their minds, left them holding the bag or the hot potato at Guadalcanal just due to supplies. So it really was more of a joke than anything. Only 50 of these were made. You can see the front there, dropping the hot potato on the Cactus Airfield, on the reverse. So 50 of these were made before the mold broke, and the Marines raised the money for these themselves when they returned to Australia following the battle. Now, why would our museum have one of these medals? Well, that's a good question. So Mark and I have tried to focus more on stories that evolve, that represent all of naval aviation. So not just the officers and the naval aviators themselves, but support staff and people who would have been on the same missions and the same battles, helping out naval aviators and working on the aircraft. This gentleman here, Ferris Connor, was a pharmacist's mate first class, and he was rendering aid to the wounded on Cactus Airfield and to other naval aviators and personnel as well. He was also a native of Jacksonville, Florida, and his widow was an Australian war bride. They met in Australia after the battle. So he brought her stateside. They lived in Jacksonville for many years, and after he passed, she wanted his medal to go to a museum here in the state of Florida, and we fit the bill because we also teach naval aviation history here, and we could tie the story to our mission, which is really special. Another thing about the medal is that it is affixed to a piece of herringbone twill, which would have come from a Marine's utility jacket. So they really went all out in sort of personalizing these pieces. This particular medal is certified as number 12, and I'll have Donald pan to the certificate just here. You can see they even made these themselves. They had to have a witness sign the certificate, and the gentleman who signed his certificate also received a George Medal. So we are very proud to have this in our collection. It tells many layered stories. It tells the story of a war bride, the widow. It tells the story of the pharmacist's mate. It tells the story of Guadalcanal. So we try to take objects in the collection that can speak to many stories and many people. And in particular, this is personal for me because I got to meet with the widow and conduct her oral history. And we'll come back to oral histories before we end today.
All right, so one of the things that you may know about us is we have a lot of volunteers that work here. We have over 300 volunteers that work in the museum, and we certainly couldn't do our jobs without them. I have 35 that work for me here in the library, and they do everything from manning the research desk and answering questions to working in the back where they process collections. And what that means is they get a collection, they organize it, they describe it, and make it available for research. We also have people that help us identify photographs. I miss you all, and I hope to see you guys soon, my volunteers. We're all watching, hopefully. And so we also, though, get military volunteers, active military ensigns who are waiting to class up. They're waiting to begin their training here at Pensacola. And so we usually get one assigned to the archive, and it gives them a chance to really delve into history and learn things that they might not otherwise learn. And so I usually put them to work with small collections. We never know when they're going to class up. It could be a week, 2 weeks. We had one that was about 4 months, so we just don't know. So I give them smaller collections they can work on, that they can learn about, and also, get some things done. And so one of the collections we pulled from our backlog, that's something that's been waiting to be processed, we pulled a collection from Frank Cheek. He was a naval aviator after World War II. And like a lot of the collections we have, personal collections, he had a squadron photo in his collection. You can see it right here. And these squadron photos are great, but oftentimes they don't come with identification. So when we were able to see that this one had all the various aviators identified in the back, it really was gold. Because not only does that allow us to identify the people from the squadron, in this case, who Cheek was and his squadron mates, but in the future, if we get research questions related to the squadron, we're actually able to identify folks for them as well. Now, this particular photograph actually came with a little note. It says, "Frank, thanks for the letter. Thought you might enjoy a picture. Regards, Shep." Oh, that was a neat little thing, a handwritten note, which again we see in various collections. And sure enough, right next to it, you can see Shep. So we know who he's talking about, from Cheek to Shep. But then we noticed that Shepherd had an interesting spelling. And so what we did was we went back, of course, to the photo. We were able to blow it up a little bit so you guys can see it a little easier. And sure enough, that photograph of that person turns out to be Alan Shepard, which, as you know, would go on to be the first American in space in the Mercury program. And so, of course, the ensign who did this, Tim DeCoitis, was very excited, as were we, that we had a handwritten note from future astronaut Alan Shepard. But also it was just a neat little piece for us to find, to see these folks identified in the squadron. And what was neat about it was, of course, we put it on social media, and people generally liked it. And this was back in 2018. Now, as I mentioned, the ensigns are only here until they class up. And the story doesn't end with Tim. So Tim began talking with his replacement, an ensign named Paul Gilchrist. And of course, after going through what the basics were and the hand-me-down of what he'd be doing in the archive, Tim pulled out this collection because, of course, it's new, it was exciting, and we all loved it. And so as we were going through and showing just what I did with you, how we found out who Alan Shepard was, Ensign Gilchrist noticed this Gilchrist. And that was pretty cool for him, but again, Gilchrist isn't that uncommon of a name. He did have several people in his family who did fly, and he didn't recognize the person. So if we flip it back over, blow it up again for you. This is the Gilchrist. Didn't recognize him, so he texted a picture of him to his family, and sure enough, they actually recognized him as his great Uncle John, Big John Gilchrist. And what was great about this was that they had no idea he had flown with Alan Shepard in VF-42 above the Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So this was a great deal for him. And the reason I love this story is it really gets to the heart of what an archive is. Archives aren't just Raiders of the Lost Ark, things on shelves and dusty and put away. What archives do are connect living people in meaningful ways to their past. And that's our job here, our mission here, and in addition to preserving history, it's connecting people and letting people really research and understand where they come from and therefore where they may go in the future. Now, I think it's time for some questions and answers.
It is. Thank you so much. This has been such a treat today to hear everything from Miss Baker down to some of these amazing stories in the archives here at the National Naval Aviation Museum. So we have a question to start us off. It says, why do you wear gloves while handling the archives and the artifacts?
Well, we wear gloves for several reasons. One is you have natural oils on your hands. So no matter how many times you wash your hands, even if you're washing them for 20 seconds at a time during quarantine, that won't protect the objects that you touch from the oils that will be left behind. So you might not see the damage today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, but you'll see it in 100 years where your fingers have touched that piece of metal or that piece of leather. So we really wear the cotton gloves to protect the artifacts, but we also wear them to protect ourselves, because sometimes we receive donations in our triage lab that are very interesting. Boxes people have pulled out of the attic that might have a rat's nest inside, for example, or mold, things like that. So they're to protect ourselves and also to protect the objects.
In archives is slightly different. So you'll notice we're wearing two different types of gloves today. Normally, actually, I don't wear gloves when handling materials because the oils for my hands would only really affect the photographs. Now, the photographs generally are sleeved, and so that allows us to handle them. I unsleeve them so that we could see them in here when you guys are filming. So that's why I'm wearing my gloves today. But y'all know, as I mentioned, these are different. Because when you're handling fragile documents and things like that, cotton gloves are things that don't allow a lot of friction. It's actually easier to accidentally tear them or not handle them correctly. So your hands and the oils from those aren't as damaging to the paper, but it's more of a safety so you don't actually rip them with cotton gloves or some other glove that doesn't allow you the friction that your fingers naturally have.
Okay, we have another question. Where do you find these documents? Do you go out and find them, or do families bring them in?
That's a great question. A little bit of both. So most of our collections are donated by private citizens, and it might be from a relative, it might be their papers they've collected over service, but we also do try to establish relationships, and they can point us to different people who we can then contact. Or squadrons. For example, we have the Red Rippers papers. We've established a relationship with them, and they continue to donate papers to us on a regular basis.
So Valerie, she's 10 years old, and she says, she has a question for Miss Dina. She says, did Miss Baker ever wear any other kinds of outfits?
Oh, that's a good question. So in our collection, we have 2 helmets for Miss Baker. Only one is on display, the rubber helmet. We have a leather helmet that she wore during her training. But rumor has it she also wore a wedding dress for her second wedding to Norman. And she didn't like it very much, so I believe she tore it off either midway through the ceremony or just prior to. But they did make her a little dress, and she wasn't too keen on wearing it.
So we have another question here. Will all the archives be digitized?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. That's probably my number one question. Its short answer is no. Not because we don't want to, but because not everything in the archive would necessarily need to be digitized, and it's also a resource issue. To document 2 million, or to digitize 2 million documents would take a long time and more than we have here. What we do instead is we prioritize our documents, digitizing them based on what people ask for and what is used the most. So digitization really has 2 components. One is preservation. If something's sort of falling apart and we don't want people handling it, we'll digitize it so people can actually access it and view it. But it also has to do with that access. So if somebody's asking for a cruise book, for example, or photos from a particular collection over and over, rather than pulling those out and scanning them every time and copying them and sending them off, we do it one time and then make the digital copies available for everyone. So we'll get as much as we can done, but it will be outside my lifetime before everything in the archives could be digitized.
So what are the criteria you use when deciding to accept a donation into the collection?
Sure, that's a great question. So we get numerous requests to donate here at the museum, both via email, via telephone, walk-ins. We are guided by a collecting policy, and that pretty much lays out our mission, the types of objects that we would collect that fit our mission, and what we have a need for. So when someone comes to visit us, we first ask them all the background information we can. We try to find out who, what, and why. So who is always important. It's never just an object. It's never just stuff. It always is representative of someone's life. And so we keep that in mind as stewards of memory. That's very important. So once we've done our research and we've interviewed the family if we can and used all of our resources, that's when we can make that determination. Is this object a good fit for the collection? Can we tell a story? Can we tell multiple stories about that object? What I wanted to add is that here at the museum, most people see the Hollywood set that we've built, and that's by design. But behind the scenes, 99% of what we do is that research and that care for the collections to make sure we're being accurate in our representation of naval aviation history.
And part of accepting is actually, we have a collections committee headed up by our supervisor, the historian. So we actually get together generally and talk about the collections that are coming in. And sort of, that way all the expertise from the different areas can speak to that. Because there's archival components, there's curatorial components, and then there's the sort of big picture of history as well, and everything Dina said. So we really work together as a team to make sure we bring that together.
So where are these items stored?
Well, so they are stored all over. And that's by design too, because we live in Pensacola, Florida. Obviously, it's a hurricane zone. Hurricanes have hit the base before. So we want to be good stewards. If you put all your eggs in one basket, that's not being very responsible. So our collections are spread out. We have things that are on display here in the museum. We have an artifact triage laboratory at an undisclosed location for security reasons. We also have the library here, the archive. We have different storage rooms throughout this building, and we have several other buildings as well. But everything is cared for professionally, climate controlled, temperature controlled, light controlled. All those factors, those variables, we take very seriously.
The majority of the archive is here in the main building, but as I mentioned, as we digitize items and make them master archival copies, so the very high-res stuff, the very big ones, we actually have those stored offsite as well on a physical drive, and we're storing them in the cloud. So if anything did happen to this space, geographically, they're saved because they are served in cloud in a server away from Pensacola, Florida.
So a question for each of you. Would you please tell us your favorite artifact or archive?
Okay. Well, so it's hard to pick one favorite. I think I have a top 10 list. But as I mentioned before, we have over 35,000 objects here, and each one tells a story. We also have a lot of things that you might not expect to find at a Naval Aviation Museum, including the Killer Cooler Kelvinator, which is a piece of trench art World War II. It was on Saratoga and Monterey. It earned the Purple Heart because it was wounded, if you will, by shrapnel during a kamikaze attack. It's a beautiful piece of history. Maybe one day we'll do a presentation just on that. And my other favorite is our ventriloquist puppet named Grandpa Pettibone that, his eyes never close. He has all the bells and whistles. He moves, and he has a coffin carrying case. So those would be my two most memorable artifacts to date.
Yeah, that's tough to beat. The guy sleeping in the coffin stuff. But I actually have a couple as well. It is hard to narrow down to one. But I'd say two are, one is a menu signed by several transatlantic flyers, and that includes Amelia Earhart, Charles Lindbergh, Admiral Byrd, among others. That one's a really unique one, really unique. We haven't found anything similar to that has everybody's signatures on it, and we'll probably do a future one of these segments on that as well. And then two, there's a piece of Italian propaganda that came from World War II. It's found on the beaches of Anzio. And this thing, for being over 70 years old, is in remarkable condition. The colors are vibrant. I had a researcher friend actually translate it from the Italian for us. And what it is it sort of talks about, the sort of, it's propaganda. So it talks about how the English were terrible all through the time, since Noah's Ark and all the way up in 1942 when this thing was printed. But it's a really interesting story. It's told in sort of a folk tale kind of way. So the drawings are very fairy tale-ish, and it's got, like I said, the colors are just super vibrant. And it's something that is just really interesting to look at and takes you back to a time when that sort of thing was used.
So what prepares you to work in this field?
Well, it definitely helps to have a passion for history. What we do, like I said, takes a lot of responsibility, and we really care about the history of people. Again, it's never just an object, but you would really ideally need to have a bachelor's degree in history or related field, and then an advanced degree. So, for example, I have a master's degree in museum studies curation. Mark has 2 master's degrees in his specialty there. So you definitely have to have the book learning, but also the practical experience. So for anyone who's interested in a career in public history, I would suggest that you volunteer at a museum like this one, or have an internship, or get that hands-on experience in addition to book learning, because that will take you far. But again, we are really passionate about what we do, and hopefully that comes across on camera, and that really is what drives it.
Okay, does your museum have relationships with other museums for sharing info and exhibits?
Yes, actually. We've spent a lot of time building those relationships up, particularly with the local museums, the T.T. Wentworth, the archive that Dean DeBolt runs up at the University of West Florida, but also the military museums around the world. Dina can certainly talk to that about the loan program. But just anytime we get together and there's professional meetings, whether it's Society of American Archivists or Alliance of Museum Professionals, we build those networks. And it is important because sometimes we'll get things in that don't quite fit here, aren't the best place for them to be viewed or researched. And so we use those relationships to reach out to them and vice versa. And it does help to have that relationship for exhibits as well, and find out, hey, maybe there's something that they could loan to us that would really sort of pop in an exhibit that we're doing, and again, something we might be able to do for them as well.
So we have time for one last question. What is one piece of advice you can give the audience when it comes to preserving their own history and memories?
Good. Okay, this is a perfect question, and it sort of goes back to what I was talking about with the oral history that I performed during the acceptance of the George Medal. This is a perfect time for this. It's almost a challenge that we have for all of you being at home during quarantine with your loved ones. We want you to pick up the phone, pick up your computer, Skype, FaceTime, whatever you need to do, and interview an older family member. And we want you to discover your family's history. Ask them questions about when they were young. Ask them what their parents were like, about their grandparents, what objects are important to them, because you need to be the curator or the archivist of your own family's story. So that is what we would encourage people to do. That's the best piece of advice that we can give you, is to ask those questions, record the answers, and be really excited about it.
And don't keep it in an attic or garage or basement.
Yeah.
Get your stuff into the house,
Yes.
Where the stable environment will keep it as well. So all that work can survive on for later generations.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us
Thank
today. Everyone, we appreciate your time and energy for visiting us here at the National Naval Aviation Museum. Join us next week on our Facebook Live series brought to you by the Museum's Foundation, where we'll be talking about the F4F Wildcat with Foundation President and CEO, Lieutenant General Dwayne Thiessen. That's this Thursday, April 30th, 11 a.m. Central Time. This Thursday, April 30th. 11 a.m. Central Time. All right, everyone have a wonderful day, and that's a wrap.